Satyajit Ray's sixth feature film, Devi, which translates as the goddess, is one of his most remarkable creations. And yet, very little critical material exists on the film, a surprising fact considering the volume of attention critics and scholars have lavished on Ray's filmography as a whole. Completed in 1960, Devi is a somber, expressionist exploration of faith and Hindu orthodoxy set largely in a village in Bengal in the latter half of the 19th century. Like many of his other films, here too, Ray chose to adapt a piece of literature, a short story written by Prabhat Kumar Mukhopadhyay, the core of which was suggested by Rabindranath Tagore, writer, polymath, and India's first Nobel laureate. An elaboration of the basic material was necessary for this film because the original story is only a handful of pages long. However, in reinterpreting the written text for the screen, Ray also sought to explore more deeply certain themes and ideas. Devi remains one of his most provocative adaptations. Perhaps Ray's own concerns for this film offer the most valuable window into what he was seeking to accomplish. As noted in Andrew Robinson's biography, Ray had expressed some misgivings about Devi and its theme's accessibility to Western audiences and critics. Quote, "The Western critic who hopes to do full justice to Devi must be prepared to do a great deal of homework before he confronts the film. He must read up on the cult of the mother goddess, on the 19th century Renaissance in Bengal and how it affected the values of Orthodox Hindu society, on the position of the Hindu bride in an upper-class family, and on the relationship between father and son in the same family." Familiarity with the Bengali language, history, and context is certainly helpful in understanding the layers of Devi. For the non-native viewer, the most daunting aspect of the film could well be the many valences of the word ma, or mother, as deployed by Ray in the film.
মায়ের নাম উচ্চারণ করতেই মা এসে দেখা দেয় এমন মা কজনের আছে বলতে পারো মা?
Although Hinduism is non-denominational, the worship of the Great Mother, or Shakti, is one of the most significant philosophical currents within it. In Devi, the character of Kali Kinkar, played by the great Chobi Bishash, is introduced to us as a rigorous Shakto, a lifelong and resolute worshipper of the goddess. Devi begins with the autumn festival that celebrates Durga, the light-skinned, benevolent form of the mother goddess. Durga is yet another incarnation of Kali, the dark one, the presiding deity of Kali Kinkar's feudal home. Durga and Kali are but two of the hundreds of different forms of the goddess, Shakti, or the Divine Mother, as she is worshipped in South Asia. Dayamoyi, played by Sharmila Tagore, is not a biological mother, but is affectionately addressed as such by Kali Kinkar and many others in the household, including the pet parrot. Daya's name signifies kindness, compassion, and mercy. She's earthly, domestic, and comfortable occupying this maternal space, especially in her interactions with Khoka, her nephew, who is indulged with the bulk of her time, attention, and tenderness. If Daya is lovingly addressed as Ma, the goddess too is subject to a similar axis of familiarity and intimacy in this part of the world. In Devi, we hear the devotional musical form of Shama Shongit, most commonly attributed to the 18th century poet and composer Ramprasad Sen. These songs frequently imagine the goddess with closeness and affection, as one would a mother or a daughter. Notably, Ray composed one of the Shama Shongit songs that one hears in Devi in Ramprasad style because he could not find one that suited his precise needs in the existing archives. Despite the felicity and ease with which Ray slipped into the role of the composer of devotional poetry and music, Devi, for him, was fundamentally an attack not on religion, but on religious dogmatism, a distinction that he rued was lost on some of his audiences. However, Devi is just as richly layered if we view it as a tragic love story and as a drama of conjugality and modernity. In Daya's burgeoning relationship with Uma Prasad, we see the beginnings of the formation of the modern companionate couple, a promise that by the film's end remains unfulfilled. Rai uses his favorite motif of the handwritten letter to signal the deepening romantic and sexual bond between the young couple, as Uma insists that his wife write to him every day while he is away in Calcutta. Attentive viewers of Rai's cinema will recall that the same actors, Soumitra Chatterjee and Sharmila Tagore, had played Opu and Aparna in Opur Sangsar just a year before in 1959, and a similar exchange regarding handwritten notes had animated their romance as well. In Devi, despite the growing closeness between the couple, the customs of the feudal family and of the historical moment ensure that Uma's claim on Daya is never absolute or even primary in Kali Kinkor's household. Rai inserts a key sequence between Kali Kinkor and Daya to signpost the power dynamics of their relationship, a sequence that is absent in the original short story. As Daya gently massages Kali Kinkor's feet, he confesses his attachment towards her as his little Ma. Kali Kinkor, we learn, had planned to lead an itinerant life after his wife's death. But Daya's arrival as a bride re-illuminated his home, and her presence has held him captive ever since.
তুই এলে ঘর আবার আলো হয়ে উঠল।
This is an excessively ardent declaration of affection. And the erotics of this moment are undeniable, supported by the mise-en-scène and the composition of the image.
অবশ্য তারই কৃপা। তখন তাকে ছেড়ে যাবো কোথায়? কি বলো মা? ভয় কাকে নিয়ে জানো মা? ভয় তোমার ওই কেরেস্টান স্বামীটিকে নিয়ে। আজকালকার ছেলে মতি গতি তো বোঝা যায় না।
But to belabor the point would deny this sequence its richness and complexity. Simply put, Kali Kinkor's obsessive attachment to the Godhead, and by extension to Daya, is strongly suggested to the audience while remaining absolutely disavowed by the principal characters. This scene plays out like a prelude, a slow build-up to the pivotal sequence that comes next. The patriarch's febrile dream makes sense, following as it does on the heels of such a weighty segment. Rai has already prepared us for it, and in the dream sequence, we see his interest in animation and graphic design come alive. The goddess's otherworldly three eyes come to overlay Daya's earthly features. Here and elsewhere in the film, we note Rai's keen eye for cinematic faces. The starkly lit close-ups of Sharmila Tagore are indeed sublime in their beauty, a reminder of cinematographer Subrata Mitro's monumental talent. Notably, and in a departure from the short story, when the dream brings Kali Kinkor to Daya's bedchamber to prostrate himself before the petrified young woman, Uma is absent.
মা এতদিন কেন বলিসনি মা?
In yet another audacious move, Rai has shifted the temporal markers of events to the latter half of the 19th century, several decades after the setting of Mukhopadhyay's original short story. It was critically important to Rai that Uma's emergent, modern, and progressive worldview be anchored in the moment when the Bengal Renaissance was at its peak. Uma is the character through which Rai's own convictions are expressed in Devi. Quote, "The son's character is very much developed in this film according to my feelings. For dramatic reasons, I was full of sympathy for him. I believed his arguments were much stronger than the father's arguments because of the irrationality involved." Uma belongs to the rentier class of landowners or zamindars, a coterie of men who had access to the best of colonial education as well as to the sweeping discourses of social transformation in the 19th century. Therefore, the Calcutta sequences remain especially important and appear to us as a virtual catalogue of the markers of enlightenment. Uma and his college friend Bhudev attend a performance of Shodhobar Ekadashi, Dinobandhu Mitro's classic satire on modernity and the social mores of the time. Moments later, we learn that Bhudev is in love with a widow, a taboo that Uma claims can easily be countered if one follows Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagor's logic of social reform. Unlike the rest of Devi, which remains superbly atmospheric, the Calcutta sequences, heavy on dialogue and studio interiors, bear the thematic weight of the entire film. Uma's modern, scientific, progressive rationality must struggle against a different and more entrenched knowledge system. We see the conflict between the two worldviews, and indeed two different forms of patriarchies, when Uma first returns to the village to witness with horror Doya's deification. He rails against his father Kalikinkor, calling him a delusional madman.
Devi Avatar. হ্যাঁ দেবীর অবতার আপনি পাগল হয়ে গিয়েছেন কি বললেন আপনি পাগল হয়ে গিয়েছেন বাবা
It is not Kalikinkor's lengthy quotation from Sanskrit poetry that temporarily silences Uma, but the shock of the miracle. An ailing child recovers from a grave illness. By this time, despite Uma's protests, Doya's fate is nearly sealed. In a brief flashback sequence, which appears much later in the film, Rai provides the viewer with a glimpse of their first encounter as husband and wife as he asks to a diffidently quiet bride. Of course, Doya is not one, but just as she is growing into an independent subject, into herself as a sensitive young woman, circumstances force her back into performing a two-dimensional icon of divine femininity. Once she is put on the pedestal, Doya loses her sense of self, but also the privacy and seclusion of the feudal home. As the goddess, she can no longer claim domestic spaces. Her bedroom, perhaps the most private space of all, is shifted to a more accessible part of the house, far away from the inner chamber she shared with Uma. Doya is abruptly thrust into the public domain, an object on display and the cynosure of 1,000 adoring eyes. Rai's compositions give us a heightened sense of her discomfort and mounting desperation. Uma does attempt to reason with Doya and rescue her from this impossible predicament. The abortive escape sequence remains one of the most heartbreaking in the film. Doya is tantalizingly close to freedom and a new life when the sight of the goddess's discarded wood and straw scaffolding on the mudflats halts her in her tracks. Although she speaks little, Doya is one of Rai's most tragic characters, because in a sense, she remains instrumental in her own victimization. Despite Uma's entreaties, at this moment, Doya is of two minds, unconvinced of her own humanity.
ও যে চোখ মেলে চাইলো
তাতে কি প্রমাণ হলো দয়া ওরকম তো কত রূপ সারে
তুই বুঝছ না গো আমি যদি
To be or not to be the goddess, but what if one is? Doya wonders plaintively. Uma cannot fully claim her in this feudal dispensation, as she remains tethered to a familial and social structure much larger than him, and he remains acutely aware of this. As a man who has absorbed the discourses of modernity, he cannot force his will upon his wife either. The final acts of Devi get increasingly darker, almost gothic in their intensity, as Doya's sanity begins to crumble under the pressure of religious and ritual fervor. She looks physically spent and emotionally depleted. When Khoka falls ill, his mother is unable to secure medical care for the child, despite the presence of a well-meaning village doctor. Medical intervention could bring misfortune to this blessed home where the goddess resides. Therefore, the enormous task of performing yet another miracle falls on Doya's fragile shoulders. But the magic cure fails to manifest this time. In Devi, as in most of his other films, Satyajit Ray does not believe in black and white characters. So everyone, including Doya and her formerly skeptical sister-in-law, succumb to the terrifying lure of the irrational in this moment of deep crisis.
তুই পারবি পারবি তো আজকের রাতটা আমার কাছে থাক
When the inevitable happens and Khoka dies, Kalikinkor too is a broken, tragic figure, a shell of his formidable self, punished for his dogged adherence to blind faith and dogma. The final and most devastating blow comes from Uma, who accuses his father of being a killer, an indictment hurled in grief and rage, devoid of any pity. There are no victors in Devi. Rai's final departure from the original short story and the crystallization of his critique is Doya's ambiguous disappearance in the penultimate scene. In the story version, she explicitly commits suicide by hanging herself with her sari. Here, Rai leaves us with a more mysterious escape into the horizon. The so-called goddess, decked out once again in her bridal finery, must finally be consigned to the elements. Although we hear him calling out to her, Uma cannot accompany Doya on this final journey. While the flesh and blood Doya disappears from the scene, the viewer is left contemplating a clay model of the goddess, a fitting object of ritual and veneration.